The day Preston Keller told me I would never leave the boat, I was 16 years old and standing in front of 32 classmates who laughed like he'd said something clever. It was a Tuesday in October, second period, and our economics teacher had asked us to share our 5-year plans with the class. Most kids said college. A few said military. One girl said she wanted to open a bakery in Portland, and people smiled at that. I stood up and said I wanted to study marine engineering, work my way up, and eventually help redesign the way coastal infrastructure moved goods and people. I remember choosing those words carefully, redesign, infrastructure, coastal, because I had been practicing them in my head since the previous summer, when I'd read an article about a Dutch firm that had rebuilt a dying harbor in Portugal and turned it into one of the most efficient freight terminals in southern Europe. I was 16, and I had found my direction. I was proud of that. Preston Keller raised his hand before I even sat down. Marine engineering, he said, in that particular voice of his, slow, amused, carrying the easy confidence of someone whose family owned the largest shipping operation in Crestfall, a fleet of 7 aging cargo vessels that still moved fish and equipment up and down the coastline. His family had money in this town, the way certain families have money in certain places, not spectacularly, but permanently. So you want to be a marine engineer. He let the word hang in the air a moment. Your dad's a fisherman. You've been on fishing boats your whole life. He paused for timing. He had good timing. I don't think they let the guys who bait the hooks design the ships. The class laughed. Not all of them, maybe half, maybe less, but enough. The teacher said his name with mild disapproval and moved on. And I sat down and stared at the surface of my desk and felt something shift inside me. Not just humiliation, something more specific. The particular cruelty of having someone reduce the thing you'd carefully chosen to be proud of into evidence that you were already less than them. I didn't argue. I didn't respond. I didn't have the vocabulary for it at 16. But I remember thinking, clearly and without drama, I'm going to learn everything they don't know. That thought wouldn't fully resolve itself for 19 years, but when it did, I would be sitting across a conference table from Preston Keller in the same coastal town where he'd laughed at me, and the company making the decision about whether his family's remaining business survived would be mine. Let me tell you about Crestfall before I tell you what it did to me, because a place like that creates a specific kind of person, and you need to understand what I was starting from. Crestfall sits at the edge of the Pacific Northwest coast, not far enough north to be dramatic, not far enough south to be warm. It's a working town, or it was when I was growing up. Fishing operations. A small port that handled regional cargo. A cannery that had been struggling since the 90s. And enough boat repair shops and fuel depots and weather-beaten diners to service the people who worked those industries. My father had been a commercial fisherman his entire adult life. My mother worked at the administrative office for the Port Authority before the port's management structure shrank in the late 90s, and her position was eliminated. After that, she cleaned houses and did bookkeeping for a couple of small businesses, and she was good at it. But everyone in Crestfall knew what she used to do and what she did now. The Keller family was the town's version of wealth. Preston's grandfather had started the shipping company in the 1960s, when the port was expanding and the fishing industry was still a reasonable investment. By the time Preston and I were in high school, Keller Maritime ran 7 vessels and had contracts with 3 regional fish processing operations. They weren't rich by any standard outside Crestfall, but inside Crestfall, they were the kind of family that got their name on the gymnasium scoreboard and didn't wait in line at the hardware store. Preston had grown up knowing that. It showed in how he walked and how he talked and how he looked at people who worked on boats instead of owning them. I had grown up on those boats. Every summer from age 9, I worked alongside my father, doing the work that actually needed doing, hauling lines, sorting catch, maintaining equipment, cleaning. I didn't resent it. I genuinely loved being on the water, and more than that, I loved the machinery. Even as a kid, I was fascinated by the mechanical systems that made it all work. The hydraulics, the winches, the navigation equipment, the increasingly complex refrigeration systems that kept catches viable through long offshore runs. I read everything I could find about how ships and ports operated, not out of some dreamy ambition, but because understanding it felt like power, like I could see the invisible architecture beneath the surface of the thing. That was the version of me that stood up in economics class and said the word infrastructure and meant it. Preston's joke, and the laughter that followed, didn't destroy that version of me, but it buried it for a while. The thing about that kind of humiliation is that it rarely happens once. For the remaining 2 years of high school, Preston found ways to return to the theme. Not obsessively. He didn't need to be obsessive. He was popular and I was quiet, which meant he had the structural advantage of never needing to work at it. At a party junior year, when someone asked what I was planning after graduation, Preston was across the room and called out without even turning around. He's going to bait hooks professionally. At a school-sponsored career fair where I was talking to a recruiter from a maritime training program in Seattle, Preston walked past with 2 of his friends and said quietly, just loud enough, "They make him wear a tie to do it at least." One of the friends laughed. The recruiter looked uncomfortable. It sounds small, described plainly like that, and I want to be honest with you. Each individual incident was small. That's what made it effective. There was nothing dramatic to confront, no single act large enough to justify the weight of what accumulated. It was a sustained, low-level communication that I had already been assigned a position, and that position was below him. Not even worth contempt, really. Worth mild, passing amusement. The way you might note a stray dog at the edge of a parking lot. Briefly, without cruelty exactly. And then you go back to what you were doing. What it taught me was how to be invisible. I got very good at that. I moved through the last 2 years of high school with a kind of purposeful smallness. I did my work, I kept my head down, I didn't volunteer in class anymore. I worked weekends and summers on my father's boat, and I saved money, and I applied in secret, telling no one until after I'd been accepted, to the marine engineering program at the University of Washington. My father cried when I told him. He was not a man who cried. He sat at the kitchen table and pressed his hands flat on the wood and stared at them for a long moment. And then he looked up at me with a face I hadn't seen on him before, and I understood that he had wanted exactly this for me, and hadn't said so because he hadn't believed it was possible. That moment was the only pure thing about the months before I left Crestfall. I have to be honest about the first 2 years of college, because there's a version of this story where I arrived and immediately thrived, and that's not what happened. I arrived at UW with a work-study placement in the engineering department's equipment maintenance lab, a financial aid package that covered tuition if I stayed above a 3.2 GPA, and no experience with the academic culture of a research university. My high school had been adequate. It had not prepared me for reading 30 pages of technical material a night, for professors who expected you to have already engaged with the supplementary readings, for the particular social architecture of a large university where you had to actively construct your own support system or have none. I had none for most of the first year. I studied alone. I ate alone. I went home to the small apartment I shared with 2 other students who were mostly absent, and I stared at my notes and felt, with increasing frequency, that I had made a mistake. Not in choosing the field. I still loved the material, even when it was hard, but in believing I was the kind of person who could do this at this level. My grades the first semester were passable but not comfortable, a 3.1 GPA that put me just below the threshold for maintaining my full financial aid. I spent the winter break working at a shipping supply company in Crestfall, saving money and trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. What I was doing wrong, I eventually understood, was that I was approaching university the way I had approached high school, by trying not to be noticed, by doing the minimum required to survive without anyone looking too closely at me. That strategy had worked in Crestfall because the goal in Crestfall had been to avoid Preston Keller's attention. At UW, invisibility just meant isolation. Second semester, I changed tactics. I went to office hours. I asked questions in class. I introduced myself to the TA in my fluid mechanics course and told him I was struggling with the transition from theoretical to applied problems, and he spent 40 minutes with me working through examples and recommended 3 textbooks that weren't on the syllabus. My grades started to move. By the end of sophomore year, I was pulling a 3.7, had a work-study promotion to a position that involved actual lab assistance rather than equipment maintenance, and had started building what would eventually become a real professional network, not through anything strategic, just through showing up consistently and being honest about what I didn't know. The mistake I made in junior year was more serious. There was a research project being run by a professor in the Naval Architecture Department, a preliminary study on wave energy integration in working port environments. It was exactly the intersection of things I was interested in, and I had done strong work in his sophomore seminar, and he invited me to participate. I said yes before I fully understood the time commitment. I was also at that point working 22 hours a week to cover the gap between my financial aid and my actual expenses, and taking an overloaded course schedule because I'd fallen slightly behind my intended program track. I spread myself too thin. I missed 3 lab sessions in 5 weeks. The professor, a precise, methodical man who I genuinely respected, removed me from the project in a brief, professional email that nonetheless communicated clearly that he considered this a significant failure of professional judgment. He was right. I had overcommitted without a plan for managing the overcommitment, and I had let people down when they were counting on me. That lesson about capacity planning, about the difference between ambition and actual preparation, cost me the research opportunity and the professor's good opinion, and both of those things would have meaningfully accelerated my career. I didn't fully understand until years later how much that one mistake had cost me, and I didn't make the same kind of mistake again. I graduated in 4.5 years, not 4, because of the junior year complications. My GPA was a 3.6. I had 3 letters of recommendation from faculty who knew my work well, and one from the professor I disappointed, who wrote me a letter that was honest and not warm, and probably accurate. I had applied for entry-level positions at 6 maritime engineering firms and received 3 interviews and 1 offer, a junior engineering position with a company called Pacific Coastal Systems, headquartered in Tacoma, that did port infrastructure consulting on the West Coast. The salary was low enough that I had to keep working part-time for the first year. I was 24 years old and sharing an apartment with a roommate and eating lunch at my desk most days, and I was genuinely, specifically happy in a way I hadn't expected. The work was real. I was in the room when actual decisions were made about actual infrastructure. My opinions, when I gave them, were occasionally taken seriously. For the next 3 years, I worked every angle of that job I could find. I volunteered for the projects no one else wanted, the small, complicated, underfunded engagements in struggling regional ports. I understood those ports better than my colleagues who had grown up in cities, because I had grown up in one. I understood the social architecture of a working harbor town, the way the fishermen and the dock workers and the cannery operators were all connected by decades of relationship and mutual dependency, the way any change to the port's operations rippled through every household on the waterfront. That understanding turned out to be valuable in ways that were hard to quantify on a resume, but very visible in the actual work. At 27, I was promoted to senior associate. At 29, I led my first major independent project, a feasibility study for port expansion and modernization in a mid-sized coastal city in Oregon. The study was eventually adopted almost completely by the Port Authority there, and it became something people in the industry cited. Not widely, but in a field that's smaller than most people realize, that kind of citation travels. I left Pacific Coastal Systems at 31 to join a larger firm, Atlantic Pacific Maritime Group, as a senior project director. I spent 3 years there. I did not enjoy the culture. It was more corporate, more hierarchical, more concerned with billing cycles than with the quality of the work. But I learned how to navigate institutional structures at a level I hadn't needed at the smaller firm. I learned how capital works, how large-scale financing for infrastructure gets assembled, how you bring a major port authority from initial concept to funded, approved project. At 34, I left to start my own firm, Iron Water Infrastructure Group, with 2 partners I had met at Atlantic Pacific. We had one anchor client, a port authority in British Columbia that had worked with me before and trusted my approach. And we had enough personal capital between the 3 of us to survive a year without revenue if necessary. It wasn't necessary. Within 8 months, we had 3 active projects. Within 2 years, we were considered one of the leading boutique firms in sustainable port modernization on the West Coast. Within 4 years, we had a staff of 22, offices in Tacoma and Vancouver, and had been featured in 3 industry publications. I want to be specific about what successful means in that context, because I'm not interested in making it sound more dramatic than it was. I was not rich in any spectacular sense. I was professionally established. I owned my business. I had financial security of the kind that let me make decisions based on what I thought was right, rather than what I could afford to do. That's a particular kind of power that most people who grew up in Crestfall didn't have. And I had stopped thinking about Preston Keller sometime around year 6 of my career. Or so I thought. The call about Crestfall came in early spring, and it came through a channel that had nothing to do with Preston Keller directly. A regional investment group, one we had done preliminary work for on 2 previous projects, reached out to our office about a distressed port asset acquisition. The Crestfall Harbor Authority had been operating at a significant loss for 4 consecutive years. The cannery had closed completely. Shipping volume through the port was down 60% from its peak. The Port Authority Board had exhausted most of its options and was in preliminary discussions about a sale. The investment group had identified a buyer, a large freight terminal operator out of Spokane, that wanted to acquire the property, cease operations, and redevelop the site as a logistics hub for a completely different supply chain. That redevelopment would employ approximately 40 people versus the current 212 who worked in and around the harbor. The investment group wanted our firm to do an independent assessment. Was the current port worth saving, or was controlled closure and redevelopment the more viable path? I didn't tell anyone in the office what the port meant to me personally. I took the engagement as a professional matter, assigned 2 of my best analysts to do the preliminary numbers, and waited for their report before I said anything about how I wanted to handle it. Their report came back in 3 weeks. The headline was that closure was economically optimal in the short to medium term. The port was operating on outdated infrastructure, using equipment that was 15 to 20 years past its efficient service life, with a management structure that had resisted modernization for reasons that were partly institutional, and partly, the analysts were diplomatic about this, personal. The families and businesses connected to the harbor had enough political weight in the town to have delayed necessary changes for years, and by delaying them, they had made the underlying situation significantly worse. The closure option would generate a meaningful return for the investment group within 5 years. The modernization option, a full rebuild of the port's infrastructure, updated equipment, sustainable energy integration, and overhaul of the management structure, would require significant upfront capital, a 4-year transition period, during which the port would operate at reduced capacity, and a level of institutional cooperation from the existing stakeholders that the analysts rated as uncertain. If successful, it would create a port that could operate efficiently and sustainably for 30 to 40 years. If the stakeholder cooperation failed to materialize, the firm would be exposed to significant cost overruns with no guaranteed outcome. Both of my analysts recommended closure. I scheduled a site visit. I hadn't been back to Crestfall in 7 years. I had been back sporadically before that. My father had died 3 years after I left for college. A stroke, quick and without warning, and I had come back for the funeral and twice in the years afterward, before my mother moved to Portland to be closer to my aunt. After that, there was no gravitational pull. Driving into town that morning, I noticed first how much had contracted. There were storefronts that had been shops when I was a teenager, now boarded or converted to other things. The main street felt narrower somehow, though I knew it was the same width. I parked at the harbor and walked the docks alone before my meeting with the Port Authority Board. The smell was exactly what I remembered: brine and diesel and the particular cold that comes off the water here in spring. The equipment I could see was visibly outdated. Some of it I recognized from when I was a kid, which meant it had been in service for over 20 years. I walked the length of the main wharf and looked at the infrastructure with the part of my brain that did this professionally, and the analysts were right. This was a port that had been kept barely alive by people who loved it and refused to let it evolve. The Keller maritime vessels were still there. 3 of them. The others had apparently been sold or decommissioned. They were docked at the far end of the pier, and even from a distance I could see the deterioration. These weren't boats that had been maintained properly. They were boats that had been used until they couldn't be used anymore, and then kept docked because letting go of them was too much to admit. I had heard things about the Keller business through the years, without looking for the information. Crestfall was small enough that news traveled through networks I was still connected to, even when I didn't want to be. The business had declined steadily through the 2000s and 2010s. Preston's father had died in 2018. Preston had taken over operations but had no real management experience, and had resisted bringing in outside consultants. He'd laid off staff, reduced operations, taken on debt to try to modernize one of the vessels without completing the project properly, and was now managing a near-insolvent company with 3 aging boats and a handful of employees who had stayed mostly out of loyalty to the family name. I knew all of this before I arrived. It didn't change how I felt looking at those boats. I'm being honest about that. What I felt was not triumph. It was something more complicated and less satisfying. The recognition that the story had not gone the way I would have written it in my head at 16. He hadn't been destroyed. He had just diminished, slowly and without drama, the way most things that don't adapt eventually diminish. There was nothing clean about it. The board meeting was at 10 o'clock in the Harbor Authority's administrative building, a 2-story structure that hadn't been significantly renovated since the 90s. Preston Keller was there. I had known he would be. The Keller family retained a formal advisory role on the board, a legacy arrangement from when they were the harbor's primary commercial operator. He was sitting at the far end of the table when I walked in, and I watched him register who I was. He recognized me in stages. First just a face from somewhere, then a name from somewhere, then the specific context: the fisherman's kid, the one from economics class, the marine engineer. I watched him put it together, and I watched him recalibrate. He looked like a man who had expected to be somewhere better by 40, and was carrying the weight of that expectation. He'd gained weight. His hair had receded. He was wearing a jacket that was professional enough, but slightly wrong in a way that communicated effort without ease. He looked at me the way people look at something that doesn't fit into the category they'd filed it in. I sat down and opened my laptop and began the presentation. I took 40 minutes to go through the analysis. I walked the board through the current operational numbers. the infrastructure assessment, the market context, the two scenarios, the projected outcomes under each. I used precise language and moved through the data without editorializing. When I was done, I opened the floor for questions. There were good questions from two board members, a woman who managed the port's environmental compliance, and a retired logistics manager who had been on the board for 12 years. They had done their homework and they pushed on the right numbers. I answered directly. Preston waited until near the end. "The modernization plan," he said, and his voice was measured. I'll give him that. "The capital requirement is roughly $40 million over 4 years. You're projecting that comes from a combination of infrastructure investment, from the acquiring group and federal Green Port grants. What's your confidence level on the federal grants?" It was a reasonable question. I answered it precisely. The grant program he was referencing had a 68% approval rate for applications that met the criteria, and I walked through the 3 criteria where Crestfall's application would be strongest and the 2 where we would need to do work. I told him the realistic range was 60 to 75% confidence on the grant portion, and that the modernization plan was structured to proceed even at the lower end of that range, though with a longer timeline. He nodded slowly, like he was deciding how to receive the information. "If the grants don't come through," he said, "and the timeline extends, what happens to current operations, to current employment?" He meant his boats, his people. "Current operations continue at reduced capacity during the transition phase," I said. "Current employment contracts would need to be renegotiated as part of the new management structure. Some roles would be eliminated. More roles would be created on the back end of the modernization. Net employment at year 5 under the modernization scenario projects to 240 versus the current 212. The distribution of those jobs across existing versus new roles is something the new structure would determine." He was quiet. The meeting ended an hour later. The board asked for 2 weeks to deliberate. I said I would be available for follow-up questions. I gathered my materials and was about to leave when Preston stopped me in the hallway. "I didn't know it was you," he said. "I know." He looked at me for a moment. "Your firm is recommending closure." "My analysts recommended closure. I'm recommending you read the full report before you assume you know what I'm recommending." He didn't have anything to say to that. "I'll be in town through the end of the week," I told him. "If you want to sit down and talk through the specifics, I'm available." I said it the way I would say it to any stakeholder, neutrally, without history. He said he would think about it. I walked out to the parking lot and stood in the cold air for a moment, and I thought, that was nothing like I imagined it would be. He called the next morning. We met at a diner on the waterfront, the same one that had been there when we were in high school. He was there when I arrived, already with coffee, and he looked like he hadn't slept well. I ordered coffee and let him start. He started in the wrong place. He tried to minimize things first, talking about the market conditions that had affected his family's business as though the conversation were about external forces rather than choices. I let him go for about 3 minutes, and then I said quietly, "Preston, I've read the financials. You don't need to explain the market to me." That landed. He stopped. Then I said, "Tell me what you actually want to know." And he did. He was afraid, not performing it, actually afraid. He had 2 employees who had worked for his family for 20 years. He had a house that was financed against the business's assets. He had a life that was structured around the assumption that there would always be a Keller Maritime in Crestfall, even a diminished one, and he was looking at a set of scenarios where that assumption failed. I listened to all of it. I let him say it. When he was done, I said, "I'm recommending modernization. I want you to hear that clearly. The closure option is better for the investment group's returns in the short term, but I don't think it's the right decision for this port, and I don't recommend things because they're convenient for the client's short-term returns. I recommend things because they're right." He looked at me carefully. "Why modernization? Your own analyst said My analysts ran the numbers correctly, I said. The numbers favor closure and isolation, but this port has assets that don't show up in standard infrastructure assessments. There's institutional knowledge here. There's a fishing community infrastructure that services this whole region. There's a coastline management function this harbor provides that would have to be replicated elsewhere at significant cost if this port closes. There's a workforce that knows this water and these operations in ways you don't just rebuild. I stopped. And there's something to be said for not closing the thing your town built its whole identity around, even when the numbers say you can. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "And Keller Maritime?" "That depends," I said. "The modernization plan requires a new operational management structure. The old one doesn't survive the transition, not because anyone decides to eliminate it, but because it doesn't have the capacity to manage what the port needs to become. The vessels that can be cost-effectively upgraded get incorporated into the new operational structure. The ones that can't are retired." He exhaled. "There's an operations manager position in the new structure," I said. "Regional commercial operations, overseeing the working relationship between the port's freight services and the fishing fleet and the regional suppliers. It's a significant role. It requires someone who knows this harbor and the people in it." I looked at him directly. "It also requires professional credentialing in port operations management that you don't currently have. A 12-week program. There are 3 accredited options, one of them hybrid, so you don't have to leave Crestfall for the whole period." He sat with that. "You're offering me a job," he said slowly. "I'm offering you an opportunity to be considered for a position," I said. "If you complete the credentialing and the evaluation process goes well, there are no guarantees. I'm not making you a gift. I'm telling you there's a door and what it takes to walk through it." He looked at me for a long time. I didn't look away. "Why?" he said finally, not hostile, genuinely confused. "Because the port needs someone who knows it," I said. "And because I'm not running a charity, and I'm not running a grudge. I'm running a project." That wasn't the complete answer, but it was the true part of it. The board approved the modernization plan 14 days later, 6-2. The investment group accepted my recommendation with conditions. They wanted a revised capital deployment schedule and a clearer milestone structure for the federal grant application. And we spent 3 weeks renegotiating the engagement terms to incorporate those changes. I presented the full modernization plan publicly in Crestfall 6 weeks after the initial board meeting. It was held at the high school gymnasium, the same building with Preston's family name on the scoreboard, which I noticed and then chose not to think about, and about 300 people came, more than I expected. They filled the folding chairs and lined the walls and stood in the doorways. I walked them through what was going to happen: the 4-year timeline, the infrastructure changes, the jobs that would be maintained and the jobs that would evolve, and the new roles that would be created. I talked about the sustainable technology integration in terms that a non-technical audience could follow because I had done that presentation enough times to know how. I talked about the federal grant application and what it would mean if it came through, and what the contingency looked like if it didn't. When I was done, there were questions. Some were about timelines. Some were about specific roles and whether particular positions would survive the transition. One man, a dock worker who had been at the harbor for 30 years, someone I recognized dimly from my childhood, stood up and said he'd heard that some firm from Spokane had been trying to buy the port and close it, and he wanted to know if that was true. I said yes, that had been one of the options considered. He said, "What stopped it?" I said, "The math changed when you factored in everything the port does that doesn't show up in a standard financial model." He nodded like that was the answer he had expected, and sat back down. There were people in that room who had known my father, people who had worked the same waters he'd worked, people who had watched me grow up as the fisherman's kid and thought whatever they thought about that. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel anything standing in front of them. I did. But it wasn't triumph. It was something more complicated. The particular discomfort of being the person who holds the decision when the people affected by the decision are people you grew up around. You learn something about power in that moment that you don't learn any other way, that having it doesn't feel the way you thought it would when you didn't have it. The presentation ended and people came up to ask follow-up questions, and I answered them for an hour and a half. At the end, the man who had asked about the Spokane firm shook my hand and said he remembered my father, and I said I knew. He said my father had been a good man. I said he had been. I walked back to my rental car alone. The federal grants came through at 71% of the maximum, which landed in the middle of my projected range. The construction phase began 6 months after the board approval. I wasn't on site daily. I had a project director managing the ground operations, and I came in once a month for review and stakeholder meetings. But I stayed close enough to know when decisions needed to be escalated. Preston completed the credentialing program. He chose the hybrid option, which let him stay in Crestfall while doing the coursework. He passed the final evaluation. He was offered the operations manager position, and he accepted it. Our interactions during that period were professional and specific. He had learned, I think, how to read the register I was operating in, not warm, not hostile, just precise, and he met me there. He knew the harbor, and he knew the people, and he was, when he wasn't being defensive, actually competent at managing the human complexity of the transition. The dock workers who had been there 20 years trusted him in ways they wouldn't have trusted an outside manager, even when the changes were difficult. I don't know what he said to those workers about me. I didn't ask. There were 2 moments I want to be honest about. The first was during the second construction phase, when we hit a problem with one of the wharf foundations that required a redesign of a significant section of the new loading infrastructure. It was expensive and it delayed that phase by 11 weeks, and it put real pressure on the project's overall timeline. In a stakeholder call, one of the investment group's representatives suggested that the delay created a reasonable basis for revisiting the closure option. I told him, clearly and without warmth, that the delay was a construction complication that was already being resolved, and that revisiting a board-approved decision based on an 11-week schedule variance was not something I was prepared to facilitate. He pushed. I didn't move. The call ended without resolution, and I spent 4 hours that evening on calls with the other investment group partners, walking through the numbers until the position was stable. The second moment was quieter. It was during a site visit in the 3rd year of construction. I was walking the new northern wharf, which was almost complete and was genuinely beautiful, the way well-designed infrastructure sometimes is, and I passed the place where Keller Maritime's 3 old vessels had been docked. 2 of them were gone. One had been incorporated into the new operational structure after a refurbishment. The others had been retired. The dock was empty and clean and already being used for something new. I stood there for a minute, longer than I needed to. I wasn't thinking about Preston. I was thinking about my father, about what he had thought every time he docked his boat in this harbor, about the permanent distance between where he was and where he wished he could be, about the way he had pressed his hands flat on that kitchen table when I told him I'd been accepted to UW, and what that meant he had believed about his own life and mine. He never saw any of this. He died before I finished my first year of college. I stood at the edge of that empty dock and thought about that for a while, and then I walked back to the site office and got back to work. The Crestfall Harbor Modernization Project was completed in 3 years and 8 months, 4 months ahead of the original schedule, primarily because the construction phase on the northern wharf went faster than projected once the foundation issue was resolved. The final cost came in within 2% of budget. The sustainable energy integration, solar and tidal microgeneration feeding into the port's operational systems. reduced energy costs by 38% from the baseline. A feature piece about the project ran in a maritime industry journal under the headline, "A Model for Working Harbor Modernization." By the end of the first full year of operations, freight volume was up 22%. The fishing fleet operations had expanded, not contracted, because the upgraded cold chain infrastructure made it viable for the regional catch to be processed and distributed through Crestfall again, instead of being transported elsewhere. Employment at the harbor and in the directly dependent businesses was at 261, 49 more than when the project began. I received 3 calls from other port authorities in the first 6 months after the completion was publicly announced. 2 of them became new projects. The Crestfall project became the most frequently cited case study in our firm's business development materials. I'm telling you the numbers because they're real and I earned them, and there's nothing dishonest about saying so. But I want to be careful about what I let them mean. There are people who would tell this story as a story about vindication, about coming back to the place that underestimated you and proving them wrong. I understand that version. I've caught myself constructing it in my own head in the years since. The fisherman's son who built the harbor they said he'd never own. It's a clean story. It's not quite right. The town that mocked me was not, in the end, primarily the people who mocked me. It was a community that was struggling and afraid, and that dealt with those things by narrowing its sense of what was possible, and taking that narrowing out on anyone who tried to imagine something different. Preston Keller was not a monster. He was a kid who had been handed a position and learned to protect it the only way he'd been taught to protect it, by pushing down on the people below him. He was ultimately the most product of Crestfall that either of us could have been. I don't forgive him. I want to be precise about that. The offer I made him wasn't forgiveness. It was a structural decision about who was most qualified for a specific role, combined with a calculation about what it would cost him to have to ask me for anything. That cost was the point. Not punishment exactly, but accountability. He had to become, at least on paper, someone who had earned the position I was offering him. The process of earning it required him to spend 12 weeks acknowledging that he didn't already know what he thought he knew. That's not forgiveness. That's just how power works when you hold it honestly. What I didn't expect was that none of it would feel like enough. The night the project completed, after the final walkthrough, after the last stakeholder calls, after my project director sent me the official completion memo, and I filed it in the project archive, I sat in my rental car in the parking lot above the harbor for about 40 minutes. The port was lit up. You could see the new infrastructure clearly even from a distance. The cleaner lines, the improved lighting systems, the charging stations for the electric cargo equipment, the wind indicators on the new wharf that fed into the port's micro-generation grid. It was mine, in the specific sense that the design and decision were mine, even though I owned none of it. I'd been 16 years old in this town, and someone had told me, in front of everyone, that I was already in the category of people who didn't build things, who maintained them for other people, who stayed in the boat. I had come back and I had built the harbor, and I was sitting alone in a rental car in a parking lot, and it was late and I was tired, and what I felt was not the thing I had been carrying for 19 years. What I felt was something more like the absence of something, the particular emptiness that arrives when you complete a task that was never quite about the task. I had spent a significant portion of my adult life building toward a capability that was real and hard-earned, and genuinely mine. The fact that a 16-year-old's joke had been one of the fuel sources for that effort didn't make the effort less real. But it didn't make the joke matter less either. Both of those things were true. My father had worked a harbor his entire life. He had died before he knew who I became. That was never going to be solved by anything I built. I started the car and drove back to the motel. I didn't look at the water. Preston sent me a message 7 months after the project completed. It was professional in tone, brief, a note that the operations side of the new harbor was performing well, and that he'd been invited to present at a regional maritime conference on community port management. He thanked me for the credentialing recommendation. He said the 12-week program had been more valuable than he'd expected. I read the message twice. I thought about what I wanted to say. I replied, "Glad the operations are performing. Good luck with the conference." That was the full reply. I don't know what he wanted from that message. Acknowledgement, maybe. Some signal that the account between us was settled, or that I had softened, or that what had happened when we were 16 was something we could now contextualize together as adults who had made their peace with it. People want those transactions. They want the one where someone who held power over them and then lost it can come back, and the person who changed the equation says, "It's fine. It was a long time ago. We're different now." I wasn't going to give him that. Not because I was still angry. I want to be clear about that. The anger had been gone for years. Not resolved exactly, more like metabolized, turned into something that moved the work forward. What I held on to was not the emotion. It was something more structural. A specific refusal to let him reframe the story into one where his late acknowledgement erased the history of the thing. He had told me I would always stay in the boat. He had believed it, and he had said it out loud, in public, to an audience, because believing it served him and saying it cost him nothing. I had built the harbor. Those two facts didn't cancel each other out. They both existed, permanently, in the order in which they occurred. That's what I held on to. Not bitterness, accuracy. I've told this story in pieces over the years to people I trust, and the response I get most often is something like, "But you did the right thing, right? You saved the port. You gave him a chance. You built something instead of tearing something down." And they say it with a kind of relief, like the ending I chose means the whole thing resolved cleanly. It didn't. I saved the port because saving it was the right structural decision, and because I am not in the business of letting personal history distort professional judgment. I gave Preston an opportunity because the opportunity was legitimately his to earn, and he earned it. Those decisions were right, and I would make them again. But they weren't acts of healing. They weren't the moment I stopped being the person who had been sitting in that economics class at 16. I don't know if that person goes away. I've thought about it enough to suspect the answer is no. What you build on top of early damage doesn't erase the foundation. It just gets higher, and if you're not careful, the foundation is still what everything runs on, even when the structure is impressive enough that no one from the outside can tell. The harbor runs well. I check the operational reports quarterly. Ironwater retained a long-term advisory contract as part of the project terms, which is standard practice for us on major completions. The employment numbers are stable. The federal environmental compliance scores have been strong. Preston's conference presentation apparently went well enough that he was invited to speak at 2 follow-up events. The town has a working, viable harbor with a 30-year outlook. My father never saw it. That's the sentence that ends every version of this story when I tell it to myself honestly. Not the numbers, not the moment in the conference room when Preston Keller registered who I was and recalibrated. Not the completed harbor lit up over the water on a cold spring night. Just that. He never saw it. And I built it anyway. And I don't know yet what that means about me.